For most people, leadership is still very quickly associated in their minds with holding a management position, having personnel responsibility, a title, and that's not what it is at all. Leadership is an attitude, and our current society is still a discriminatory society, a racist society, a society in which a great many people are simply not treated equally. Because the more AI, artificial intelligence there is, the more emotional intelligence we need, and I really believe it's absolutely crucial that we engage with this topic. What challenges are we as humans facing in these times?
Yes, a warm welcome to all our listeners and viewers to a new episode of Digital.Decoded, our podcast about sales, AI, leadership, and everything related to it. Today we have another guest with us, and I'm especially happy, Lena, that you're joining us today. The two of us know each other from our time together at Microsoft, and today we want to talk with you about a topic. I know it's something close to your heart, but also to ours, namely diversity and inclusion, especially in the context of AI. I'm really glad that you're here. Lena, Stern magazine once called you an ambassador for emotions, and I know this because I worked closely with you at Microsoft. People love listening to you, not just because what you say is smart, but also because it's often courageous. And I'm especially looking forward to our exchange with you today.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction and the kind invitation. I'm also really looking forward to our conversation.
I'm glad to hear that, Lena. Lena, would you like to briefly say a few words about yourself? What defines you? Who are you?
With great pleasure. Yes, I'm Lena, and as you already mentioned, we know each other from our time together at Microsoft. I've now been at Microsoft for almost 10 years. I started back then in corporate communications and am currently the diversity and inclusion lead for Germany. But since July, I'm on sabbatical. So right now, I'm also trying to change my perspective a bit and take a break, which is quite unusual for me personally, because I've actually been working continuously since I was 17. I've been working nonstop since I was 17. I'm originally a trained childcare worker and worked in that profession for several years. To this day, I have neither a high school diploma nor a university degree. And that's why it's really strange now, but also very exciting to be able to take a little career break.
Lena, I can imagine. And especially in the current times, I think I'm not exaggerating when I say that right now. I mean, geopolitically on the one hand, which we don't want to talk about today, but also technologically, we're experiencing something significant at the moment. There's a reason people have said that the year 2023 was like a fascinating decade in itself. And I think 2024 is no different. And what we've already seen this year in terms of innovation and progress is truly fascinating. But Lena, maybe a question specifically for you. How do you perceive the current debate around artificial intelligence? Is it primarily hype? Is it genuine hope? Or is it a truly significant challenge?
Oh, I think what we're seeing with AI right now is mainly what we always see when a major, truly epochal change takes place. And we can look back through history for examples of this. It's really something that repeats itself in this pattern. On the one hand, there are always a lot of people who are afraid of it. And I think it's really important to take these emotions seriously and above all to understand where they come from. Because fear of change is actually something very important for us humans. If we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, it was always crucial for our survival that things stayed the way we knew them. And anything that meant change, anything that was different or unfamiliar, could quickly become life-threatening in the past. And that's why this fear of change is, first of all, simply a completely natural reaction that people have. And I think then it quickly splits into two groups. There are people who try to overcome this fear with a kind of curiosity, who say, yeah, it's kind of strange, everything feels weird, but I want to take a look at it. And then there are people who say, no, for heaven's sake, I want to keep that as far away from me as possible. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now with AI. And I actually believe that this very curiosity is so important in order to overcome fear. And curiosity doesn't have to mean that I immediately launch a huge AI project, but rather that I just try it out. And if that's in your personal everyday life, it's worth mentioning that a large part of people use AI in their daily lives without even realizing it. These are things built into our smartphones, automations that are already integrated into our computer programs. And I think it's important to understand that. But now in the bigger picture, I personally have to say that I see a huge opportunity in AI, in the developments that are coming with it, but at the same time also an enormous responsibility that we have. We as people, let's take the three of us now, Mario, you, André, you, and myself, who work with AI, even if only remotely, of course, have a very big responsibility. But fundamentally, so does everyone who uses AI. And yes, this responsibility can sometimes be quite heavy on the shoulders, I would say.
I'd like to jump in there. Lena,
Please, Mario.
first of all, it's nice that you're here. We are delighted, and the topic of diversity and inclusion is particularly close to my heart. Why do we come back to this later? But exactly what you just said, I also feel that in my daily work, on the one hand, within our organization of almost 1,000 employees, but also in interactions with Microsoft or with customers. And you can really notice these two sides, of course. There are those who say, great, AI is the new cure-all. And there are those who say, whoa, we need to be careful here, and maybe haven't really looked into it in detail. And I find that really, really fascinating, because what I also find interesting as a reflex, something we discuss internally, of course, but I notice it everywhere in the market, is that now is exactly the time when we should be focusing on this, doing AI enablement, change management, bringing people along, and so on. And I still feel that usually gets skipped because people say, oh, look, it's just like Google. You just need to type in a few prompts and everything will be great. How do you perceive that?
Yes, definitely. I had to smile just now when you described it like that, because I think this idea of it being a miracle cure this year is, of course, total nonsense. AI is not going to solve everything. And I think there are also major challenges placed on us personally in this age of AI, you could say. And I assume you have both read the book Tools and Weapons by Brad Smith, which I find very, very fascinating in the general context of technology, because it reminds us again and again that technology itself is, first of all, neutral, and it's up to us humans to determine whether this technology becomes a tool or a weapon. And it's the same with AI. It has the potential to go in both directions. AI will never be a cure-all. I think we all agree on that. There are many things that AI cannot and will not solve, but it can be an incredibly important tool in almost every area of life. And at the same time, it can also become a very, very dangerous weapon. And I think this image is so important that we are aware of what our responsibility is in this age of AI. And lately, I talk about this very, very often. I think that was actually the keynote that was booked the most for me last year when I was on stage, namely with the headline, "The more artificial intelligence there is, the more emotional intelligence we need." And I really believe it's absolutely crucial that we address what challenges are being placed on us as humans in this era, and how we ourselves can become better people again, after having spent decades trying to be very good machines ourselves.
You're really hitting on something true there. I'd actually like to go back to one point, because earlier you talked about fear and also about responsibility. And I often compare this, since I also give talks on the topic of artificial intelligence. I always like to make this comparison. I show a picture of a match where the spark jumps, and for 500 million, or rather for years, humans have apparently been able to control fire. Yes, and I think it's similar with AI. AI, as you said, can become a weapon just as fire can, and all forms of fire. But I believe it's our responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. That's one thing. The second thing, which I find very, very interesting, and I'd really like to hear a bit more from you about this, you mentioned the topic of emotional intelligence, meaning that our human abilities, such as showing emotions, are becoming increasingly important. And that's a topic that doesn't just concern people in general, but if we look at the business side, it's also about leadership. So how important is the topic of emotional intelligence in the area of leadership for you?
Oh man, yes, I would have to say that is absolutely one of my all-time favorite topics. I generally find leadership to be an incredibly fascinating topic, and at the same time, it's a hugely misunderstood one in our working world. I think for most people, leadership is still very quickly associated in their minds with a management position, personnel responsibility, a title, and it's none of those things. Leadership is an attitude, and I'm absolutely convinced that an intern can have leadership just as much as a CEO can. For me, it has nothing to do with hierarchy, a title, or a level. And it's exactly this attitude that is just as important. And when we talk about attitude, it's absolutely clear why emotional intelligence is so important. Because in order to have a clear attitude, I need to be able to reflect on myself well. I need to have genuine self-awareness. And I say this very deliberately with this pause because I also think that we often misunderstand the term self-awareness a little bit. And I really need to be very aware of who am I as a person, what defines me, what drives me and what else, what excites me, what really gets on my nerves when working with people. And all of that is this self-awareness from which a clear leadership attitude can emerge. And that's the only way it works. And I think that already makes it very clear where emotional intelligence comes in and has to be present. The foundation for this is to develop this clear attitude and to be able to say, what do I want to stand for in my leadership approach? What defines me? And then, if we maybe build a bridge to the topic of AI and the challenges that teams and employees are currently facing, there are, of course, so many uncertainties and so much ambiguity. There isn't a predetermined path. Instead, we have to take paths that no one has walked before us. And that means we don't know. There is no clear plan for it. And that's exactly why we need very, very strong trust within the team so that we can develop the courage to say, yes, we're going to take this path, even if we have no idea what it will look like or what we will encounter along the way. And at the same time, for the leadership person, the one who, if we stick with this image, goes ahead into the thicket without knowing where the path is, it's just as important to have the trust of the people who are supposed to follow this path. And that's only possible with emotional intelligence. When I understand what André needs in order to trust me, and on the other hand, what Mario might need, because every person is different in this regard. And yes, I think you can tell that this is a very, very important topic for me, something that fascinates me immensely and I believe plays a key role in this whole AI development.
I have a quick follow-up question, Mario, before we move on to the topic of diversity and inclusion and where we actually stand on that. Lena, I really like the way you just explained that. So leadership doesn't mean title, leadership doesn't mean position or hierarchy, but especially in the age of technological progress and AI, leadership has, in my view, a much more important significance. And would you agree if I said that AI helps us humans to be human again? It's a bold statement, but do you see any truth in it?
Absolutely. I think I would absolutely sign off on that immediately. However, I would probably suggest we replace the word helps with the phrase challenges us. Yes, that's exactly right, because that is a much more accurate description of what it is. We were just talking about that. In the past decades, we've really learned to function almost like machines or robots, and to work that way as well, extremely well, in fact. Of course, that was also what the industrial age demanded from employees. And now we're being challenged because there is technology that functions like machines, like robots.
Well, I'm a fan of these value compass theses because when you look at leadership, you described it so nicely with the epaulets just now, as André said. I think a lot of people underestimate that. Many people think, now I get the right title and suddenly everyone is looking at me, or I'm suddenly a role model because I have the epaulets and now I'm doing everything right. Quite the opposite. At least for me, and this has nothing to do with AI. For years, I've only promoted people when I've already seen beforehand that they've proven themselves and that they're also seen as leaders. Because at the end of the day, I always think that taking the next step to the next title is actually easy. But to stay in that position and to be accepted by people or to truly live out leadership so that people actually follow you, or maybe even more people will follow in the future, that I think is always the...
Absolutely, of course, certainly.
I think you've said everything about that and you just mentioned it already. We also want to talk again about the topic of diversity and inclusion in connection with AI. And I mentioned right at the beginning that this is a topic that personally I would say I am more than just involved with. I had a brother with a severe disability. He was severely disabled from birth. My mother ran a sports club for people with disabilities, and it already starts with the question, are you even allowed to say disabled anymore, or are there other terms for it? At the end of the day, I believe, and this is my experience, I had a lot of contact with people with severe disabilities and also with disabled people during my youth. The interesting thing I always noticed was that people themselves never experienced feeling impaired at all. Only when this impairment or their difference was reflected back to them from the outside did they start to feel impaired. And I found that really, really fascinating. And that's also where I have a lot of hope when it comes to AI. I'd be interested in your opinion on this, Lena, because especially with AI, voice AI, for example, there are so many possibilities today to advance inclusion. And we also have to think about many different groups of people. For example, this morning I heard a report about people in Germany, there are also a great many, who have difficulty, for instance, reading things, recognizing writing, and so on, where of course a voice AI could do a tremendous amount of good. Maybe we can start with that topic. What's your perspective on it?
Yes, absolutely. That's, of course, a very, very big and extremely important topic. Maybe just very briefly, because I always find it quite interesting. Like you said, is it even okay to still say disabled? I always think it's really especially important to actually ask people how they want to be referred to. And I know a lot of people who say, yes, I am disabled and it's important to me to be called that. But I also know people who don't want that because, just as you said, it's something that comes from the outside or because they see themselves differently. And I think it's really important to pay attention to that. And that actually leads us nicely to the topic of language. So, how can we shape language so that it is inclusive? And that's where AI can really help us a lot. It already starts with saying, okay, I want to optimize this text. I mean, I don't know, but I think ChatGPT is probably what most people use in their daily lives by now. You can say, can you maybe check this text for me? See if it's inclusive, if it's understandable. Can you translate it into simpler language for me? And I think these are all really, really exciting possibilities that are out there. Just like you said, voiceover or conversely, automatically generated subtitles in videos nowadays. I've got a frog in my throat right now, sorry. Exactly, subtitles are also a topic in themselves. So when I think about how much time we used to spend back then, André, you and I made a lot of videos together at Microsoft in corporate communications, and how much effort it took to get the subtitles right, to write them in at the correct timestamps and so on. And now all of that can be done with AI. That's a huge benefit. And of course, it really helps us a lot, especially when it comes to inclusive activities in our daily work. But here again, we're back to the topic of responsibility because it also depends on which people are involved in shaping and participating in AI processes. And I think we've all experienced that just because something is well-intentioned doesn't necessarily mean it's well executed. And I believe that if only people who aren't personally affected or who don't share that lived reality are the ones developing programs or tools, then even if they mean well, but in the end, the result might not be at all what actually helps the people who need it. And I think that's so important. And in the broad field of diversity and inclusion, there's a wonderful guiding principle that I always remind myself of, which is nothing about us without us. So what we're essentially saying is that regardless of which particular aspect of diversity we're referring to, whether we're thoughtfully discussing it, developing important projects, or designing tools and technologies, it's absolutely essential and necessary to involve people who are directly affected and who possess that specific lived perspective, because we can never truly fully take on or completely understand that perspective ourselves.
That's true, yes. This is an extremely important topic, and you're touching on it a bit, Lena, when you talk about training data being discriminatory. We've seen this happen quite often in the past. Just think of the publicly available images on the internet, where unfortunately there are mostly older white men and all other groups are sadly underrepresented, which of course automatically leads to discrimination. You also say, and I think that's very good, that we need to include everyone and pay attention to this. So again, the key word is responsibility. We have to train AI in such a way that it recognizes the diversity in our society. How do you see it? How are these different groups, whether it's disabled people, people of other nationalities, or whoever, how are they currently experiencing this whole AI debate, especially in terms of inclusion and diversity? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yes. So I think, again, we're at the point where I might be able to represent many perspectives myself, or at least some of them. So I'm a woman, which means I can naturally bring that perspective to the table. And as you said, as a woman, it's often quite shocking what kind of images you get when you search for something. I myself didn't grow up with the German last name I have today, but with a Croatian one. That means that's also a perspective I can naturally understand, for example, when it comes to names, that there's very, very little diversity when we look at things like that. Then I'm queer, and that's also a perspective I personally have and can see. That's also something that's absolutely underrepresented in this whole area. But of course, on the other hand, there are many different perspectives that I personally do not have myself. So, for example, I am not a person of color, and at this time, I currently do not have a disability. In those particular cases, I can only talk to people or listen to their stories and try to understand their experiences. And as you said, I think that's actually very different again right now. The perception is, and of course it really depends on the specific context and let's say the particular tools or instruments that we're looking at or considering in this situation. And basically it's the case that these tools learn from the current data of our society, and our current society is still a discriminatory society, a racist society, a society in which very, very many people are simply not treated equally. Even though we live in a very good democracy in Germany, the reality is still exactly that. And I think we really need to be aware that AI works with the status quo. And actually, for AI to function meaningfully, it would have to work with the utopia that there is no discrimination. But this utopia is still so far away that it is extremely difficult. And that's why I always find it so important to include these many perspectives, to always ask, how do you perceive this? What could be done? And to come together and look at how we can shape this future together. Because I think it's so important to realize that the future isn't already set in stone somewhere. It's not like it's written down somewhere that this is how things will be in 10 years. Rather, it's something we can always actively help decide. And it's also our responsibility whether the future turns in this direction or that direction. And I think it's important that we keep this in mind and remind ourselves of it again and again.
Lena, do you think we need to act quickly? Because what really worries me are two aspects. On the one hand, of course, we all see the opportunities that AI presents. That's clear. But on the other hand, when I look at American IT giants, they're all somehow doing away with censorship in some form. That means discrimination is no longer being curbed either. That's one thing. And the second thing, which in my view is another huge driver, we also heard about this over the weekend. There's now the first supercomputer in Germany, quantum computing. So everything is getting faster and faster in terms of computing power. The breakthrough is just around the corner. Yes, I once had the chance to talk to a professor about this topic. He said, well, within the next 3 to 5 years, we'll know if it's coming, but we don't know exactly when. And it could even happen within a year. And now it seems to be coming more and more. And as a result, the speed that we're all experiencing around AI will, in my view, increase dramatically. And if we then combine that with this abundance of data from learned old discriminatory patterns, the question for me is, do we still have a window of time to somehow correct this, or do we maybe not have that anymore? How do you see that?
Well, I think it would be absolutely fatal for me to give an assessment of that right now, because as you said, there are still so many variables involved. When will that moment happen? Where will it happen? So I also think that's a big issue right now, especially when we look at the USA. You really can't rely on anything anymore. Even when it comes to the major research institutions, they may have the highest standards and try to be as neutral as possible, but they simply can't do it anymore, or they're not allowed to. They are being deprived of the ability to do so. And I think there are just so many variables that come into play here. So it would be absolutely pointless to say now, I see it this way or that, or I believe it will turn out like this or that. What I think is important is simply that we recognize our responsibility every single day, and that responsibility isn't just something we have when we're working on a big quantum computing project, but it's something we have as individuals. And it's not just people like us who all work in the tech industry in some way. Every single person has this responsibility, no matter what industry we work in. It's about how we interact with each other in everyday life, how we talk to one another, how we might also allow for different opinions, how we build bridges instead of walls, how we try to be empathetic, even when someone might have a completely different attitude than our own. And I think that's exactly what's so important, that we don't just let this polarization happen and don't just say, well, I can't change anything about this development anyway. We can all really make a difference every single day.
That really can't be emphasized enough. Lena, I absolutely agree with that. And unfortunately, we have to slowly wrap up, even though I could honestly discuss with you, Mario, for hours. But I still have 2 final questions. And SPNG, feel free to jump in if you have one as well. You just emphasized the topic of emotional intelligence again. Can you actually learn emotional intelligence as a leader, as a person in general?
Yes, absolutely. That's also something I only really understood and learned through the research for my book, which I wrote about this very topic. I had to smile about it because a few years ago I had a manager, and I think you know who I'm talking about. And this manager said to me back then, "Oh, empathy and emotions, that's not really my thing. Why don't you handle that in the team?" And at the time I said, "Sure, no problem. I'm happy to do it because I really do enjoy it because it's fun for me." Today, I would never accept that again. I mean, I'm happy to take on things, but I would tell that person, "No, wait a minute, you can learn this, you can practice it." And I think that's so important. So there aren't just head or gut people. That's been scientifically disproven. That's not how it is. There aren't just the rational ones and the emotional ones. We are always all of it, all the time. There may be different degrees, and some of us may simply have had more opportunities to train this emotional intelligence or to practice this ability for empathy. But that doesn't mean that people who maybe haven't been able to practice it in recent years are incapable of it. And I think it's really important to have this attitude in the first place. Yes, we can all learn this and then also incorporate it into our everyday lives with small things. And it's just like real sports training. It's not about the big things, but rather about the small things that you practice in everyday life and really on a daily basis. And it starts with that. We've already talked about this. How aware am I of myself? How can I even reflect on my own emotions? And I think just pausing for a moment, maybe 3 times a day, morning, noon, and evening, that's always something I recommend. So just set an alarm on your phone, and in that moment, take a brief moment to consider, how am I feeling right now? And it sounds so simple, but just this exercise, taking a minute to briefly think about how you're feeling right now. Do I feel stressed? Do I feel under pressure? Am I maybe a little anxious? Am I angry? Am I maybe totally motivated and excited? Am I curious? Just practicing that, feeling and understanding it for yourself again. And as soon as we do that, we can recognize it much, much better in others as well. And above all, we have a much greater interest in understanding it in others.
May I just briefly add a point here, because I think what you're saying is great. So as a little practical tip for the listeners as well, because you can also do this in meetings. In our old company, easy for you, we also implemented what's called holacracy, but in an adapted form. And within the meetings, you always start by asking each individual, "Tell me briefly, how are you doing?" And that's just a very brief moment. Depending on the employee, the answer is usually just all good, not so great, or today is tough. Some people share a bit more, but just the fact that you ask, show interest, and give people the opportunity to express themselves, and that everyone gets a turn. So there was no one who was allowed to say, "No, I don't want to say anything right now." Instead, the rule was always clear at the end of the day. Everyone has to briefly say, "I'm doing well," or "I'm not doing well." Of course, some people fib a little sometimes. But with this little move, as I like to call it, you simply managed to shift the focus onto the people. And what was really interesting was that we always had 2 types of reactions. We had people, let's say those with more emotional intelligence, who said, "Yes, that's really important. Let's definitely do that." Then there were the others, similar to your colleague you just described, who said, we don't need that. It's unimportant. It just takes away from the efficiency of the call. I found that really interesting. And honestly, it only costs you 5 minutes in a meeting, but it creates a completely different atmosphere.
Absolutely. So I think it's just as important to open up that space, and whether people actually use that space. And as you said, whether they might share something or just say, "Well, yeah, I'm fine." And because maybe they don't feel comfortable using that space at the moment, that's totally okay. And I really think these check-ins at meetings are very important, just to practice that as well. I find that really fascinating. And by now, I would even say that I find checkouts at the end of meetings even more important. Just to say, hey, okay, and how does everyone feel about what we've discussed? What did everyone take away from this? Is everything clear to everyone? And that's so interesting, because we all know those situations where you've just spent an hour together in the same meeting, and then you meet in the coffee kitchen, have a quick chat, and suddenly feel like, wait, were we even in the same meeting? Because what you're talking about, I didn't pick up on at all. And I think that's exactly why it's so important to do a checkout like this, because it also trains our ability to empathize, to notice, hey, wait a minute, Mario understood something completely different than I did, and André is taking away some to-dos that I thought were mine. And just like you said, having both a check-in and a checkout creates so much space, and it only takes a few minutes. No one can tell me that's a waste of time because in the end, it actually makes the meeting much more efficient since there's much more clarity about how people are doing, but also about who is taking what with them and how we move forward, how we continue on this path that we want to walk together as a team.
Totally human, Lena. First of all, thank you so much for the inspiring insights, for all the practical tips, for your perspective. You know, Marion and I always end our podcasts with the phrase, stay human. And I think that fits this episode perfectly, like hand in glove, because we as people are becoming human again, among other things, because AI or technology is actually challenging us to be human again. We talked about diversity, about variety, about inclusion, and how important it is that we are a reflection, not just of a utopia, as you said, but of real society, and not what, unfortunately, we still often see in society today. And you spoke about the responsibility that we as people have, that companies have, and how important emotional intelligence is at the end of the day, and that it's something you can really learn. I think that's, how should I put it, a glimmer of hope or something that gives us courage. Yes, I think it gives us courage that we really can shape our future. And in that sense, I want to say thank you very much to you for your insights. I don't think this is the last time we've spoken, and all that's left for me to say is stay human.